survivors of an ice age created by a failed attempt to stop global warming are on a train to nowhere, and after being subjected to unbearable conditions, the low-class passengers finally decide it's time to revolt. That's basically the story of Snowpiercer. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hello, hello.
And I thought that, one thing that we've kind of used in our discussions is a lot of looking at symbolism and metaphors and stuff like that. So I thought that, what kind of led us to talk about Snowpiercer was a somewhat controversial video about that. Apparently, there's this theory about Bong Joon Ho using Willie Wonka as the inspiration, or that he's basically hiding Easter eggs in Snowpiercer. And so my question then is that whether sometimes we can go a little bit far with like our fan theories and just how we look at symbolism, that maybe there's just nothing there.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of see that a little bit. You've got a whole sort of train car full of Charlie buckets in this one. And I guess, most of the rest of the train are the other kids. I guess but there's never any, the whole point of Wilford's character is that he's trying to balance and maintain and manage society. Willy Wonka doesn't really symbolize that to me. He symbolizes, the realization of dreams and how you go about doing that. It's not really, they're not, I can see why people would draw the comparison, but I think thematically they're really quite different. Willy Wonka's more about parenting. It's about, as I say, I suppose in a way you could say that how we manage society is a form of patriarchal control over the different classes, perhaps, but there's no sort of, if anything, it's a very amoral, story. It doesn't really have any kind of clear messages of don't watch TV or, don't chew gum.
I think one clear, parallel is to kind of look at class structure, though, because, Charlie Bucket, we're seeing like kind of abject poverty and stuff. And here in, Snowpiercer, as we'll get into the original, we see really clear kind of lines drawn between, kind of the tailies, the people in the, bowels, if you will, of the train and stuff. And it kind of really, it kind of reminds me also of like, a look at the Titanic and stuff is like another one where we really see that, really stratified class structure. And so in Willy Wonka, when Charlie kind of, gets the golden ticket, he's kind of propelled into like this other world that otherwise he just has no contact with and stuff. So I think that's one thing that is kind of interesting, that we're, in just terms of, that breaking the barriers between class structure is something that we do see in both movies. And so whether or not there's an actual connection between Willy Wonka and, Snowpiercer, I think that's one, that's one connection that it's really hard to argue.
No, definitely it is. It's definitely, there's an element of that. Of course, you in Willy Wonka, it seems like poor people are almost, perfect angels who don't do anything wrong, really, except for drink a bit of fizzy lifting drink. But I think what's interesting about this one is they show the ugly side of both sides of both the manipulations of the higher class people and the tailies in the back. So different one. Also, of course, you meet Willy Wonka straight away in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. You don't get to meet Wilford until the end, really, in Snowpiercer. So. But he does have WIL in his surname, though, so it's kind of like, I don't know. It feels like a subtle nod, but I think the main, as I said earlier, I think the general theme is different in my opinion. So.
I wouldn't put it beyond Bong Joon Ho, though, because he's clearly somebody who loves cinema, and you see that in each of the things that he makes, that it's a mix of subtle nods to just kind of like Quentin Tarantino, that he's more than happy to kind of steal like an artist, and like different times like that. What you really just see is a real appreciation of this kind of history of cinema, that like that he's not like in any means kind of looking at doing things that just what everybody else is doing, or that like what's kind of in vogue and all that kind of stuff. He's looking to kind of do really interesting mixes of genres too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I was this is the first time I watched Snowpiercer, actually, the movie, and I was very impressed with it. It's actually been one of my favorite movies that we've watched recently.
Oh, okay.
I think, so far. I thought it was very good. I mean, for me, it's quite a philosophical movie, in that you can kind of say, in some respects, we talk about being in a mortal coil, they're literally on a coil that's sort of going around. And,
right.
and I kind of feel in a way it's quite effective as a movie, perhaps rather than a TV series, which we'll get into later, because it has a very sort of confined beginning and end. So you can make that kind of parallel to the journey of life almost. And it's we're kind of stuck in this, in this kind of very sort of in our own kind of train tracks of life, trying to get from bottom to the top end and trying to avoid all the suffering in between, basically. So, and at a very general level, it is kind of quite philosophical, but I think in other ways, like you said with Titanic, that's another good example of that class structure. You've got this one. What I found interesting was how the different cars from back to front were what people were doing as these cars progressed. Because I kind of felt in some way, and this may have just been my interpretation, but I think it was almost like this is what society values at different layers of the train. So you kind of, and I thought, because it really struck me that education, the school was right the next train after the back of the train, which to me says this is definitely, he realizes that we don't value state education in most Western countries. And, nightclubs and drugs were kind of like the one before you got to the first class.
Right.
There was a kind of, it was almost like education, then sort of food and produce, and then sort of nightclub, and then drugs, and then data, and then operations, and then it was the boss, basically. Right. So I thought that was very interesting. That I felt that was a real parallel of perhaps what he thinks we actually value in life. And I think Titanic, as you said, is kind of similar. You have the different stratified layers of who's important and who's not, but more in a historical context rather than, this one. So,
yeah, I think one of the things that's, for us, it's also interesting is that, Bong Joon Ho is somebody who, I've kind of watched some of his other stuff before and really, appreciated, his work and stuff like that. And then most recently, of course, that now he's gotten world recognition. So, once you kind of, done multiple Oscar winners and stuff, pretty much you can write your own ticket. So I think like Peter Jackson, it'll be interesting to see what he does next. Like when you have that kind of clout, right, you can really just write your own ticket and, no pun intended. And I think, it'll be really fascinating to see, whether he does like his, because, he's done like a monster movie, The Host and stuff, which was a kind of a relatively low budget. I guess it depends on what you consider a low budget stuff, but it for what it was more or less still considered like an indie film and stuff, and it clearly shows a love for that kind of genre, and certainly with bigger budgets, as we've seen with Peter Jackson, then you can kind of do some really incredible things and stuff. So I don't know if he will or not, but I'm definitely interested in what he's doing next and stuff as well, beyond like kind of what we talked about today.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I actually wanted to watch Parasite as well, so I could get a little more sort of insight into his movies, but
right.
I didn't get time, unfortunately. So, but I am looking forward to watching that one. I mean, what I did notice was though that this was also somewhat. Park Chan Wook was somewhat attached to it.
Right, and certainly we've talked about him from Oldboy, so yeah.
and I kind of felt there was similar sort of elements to this.
Absolutely.
In that there was obviously a lot of action, but there was also some very kind of quirky and surreal moments, and very, very kind of very kind of strong imagery as well. And of course, there's that massive fight scene down the train, which totally reminded me of Oldboy. So yeah, and I think that's what I think it just worked on lots and lots of different levels.
Yeah, it felt like kind of like a Spielberg Lucas collaboration for Raiders and stuff. It kind of had that feel to it.
Right. Yeah, of kind of slightly off kilter Korean cinema.
Right.
The Spielberg and Lucas of that world. But yeah, no, I mean, I really enjoyed it, and I think it was just sort of things like the weird hand gestures, sort of that were sort of semi-religious, but that you later found out what they actually meant. That was really cool. The slipping on the fish, sort of randomly in the fight, was really reminded me of Oldboy. And I think what I really liked about it was some characters that you identified or things that seemed fairly innocuous later got revealed to be really quite horrible, and you realize. Like I mean, there's lots of things I don't want to totally spoil it, but yeah, I mean, the character of Chris Evans and the fact that he's at one point like eating humans, and he knows that babies taste best. That was a pretty gruesome reveal. I mean, so it was pretty.
That line, like kind of, I mean, on the one hand, it was horrifying. The other, I couldn't help but laugh in a twisted way because it was Chris Evans, kind of, this is Captain America, saying that,
I know. Yeah, and I have to say, full props to Chris Evans for going for a role like that. And Tilda Swinton, because this is not an obvious movie that if you came through your letterbox or your email, I should say, you would think, oh yeah, okay. It's a kind of slightly depressing, gruesome movie about people trapped on a train, So yeah, and I thought Tilda Swinton was excellent in it as well. The false teeth was really effective. That's another just weird kind of detail in there. But one thing I did want to say about that is that it might seem completely horrific and awful, but actually there are still parts of the world where aborted fetuses will get made into an alcoholic drink. In various stills. Yeah, that's something. When you travel around various parts of the world, you learn some surprising things, is all I can say. So yeah, that still happens. So there you go. We're not so far away from it all.
One of the lines with that I felt only Tilda Swinton could really execute was I'm the hat and you are the shoe, and the I don't think anybody else could really pull off that line as well as she could.
Yeah. I mean, that was another really surreal thing. But I mean, it was just a complete kind of dehumanization of these lower class tailies. And I think there's this kind of, that was the other thing that was similar to some of the stuff we've been watching recently, in that they were really completely dehumanized, the people in the tale, completely sort of beaten down, having their children taken away, and I mean, it was. Yes, very depressing kind of existence it seemed for them.
And it's I think connected to like our discussions with Planet of the Apes, in the sense that I think it's easier sometimes that when we kind of do something like that to a something that's not human and stuff, right? Then it's like kind of almost a way. I'm not saying that we should ever do that, but I'm saying that at the same time, it's almost more. Palatable, or that like kind of we can accept it that like, oh, it's it's an animal and stuff like that, and I'm saying in the sense that like that's almost like kind of how we self-justify it. But when we kind of treat another human being as something that's not human, which happens in war, happens in kind of crises and stuff like that, it's really it kind of goes beyond. I mean just like what you said about kind of the, with the aborted fetuses and stuff. It kind of really crosses a certain line, and I think that's the thing. I feel like one of the things that Snowpiercer really does well is convey this idea that like, you know, there's such desperation that people, you know, like kind of just, you know, not only cross that line, but also it's institutionalized, you know, and I feel like that's kind of in a way a metaphor for, you know, capitalism, that like where lives are no longer valued as people, but they're just resources. They're just like kind of, you know,
Human
where
resources.
like, you know, that they're expendable, and it's like kind of, you know, I think it's interesting that we haven't really looked at any kind of full-blown war movies that like where that kind of thing happens, but here in this kind of setting, you know, I think that, you know, sci-fi does actually do that at different times, that like they just, you know, really look at you know, this element of you know, dehumanizing, and where we do this with capitalism, or where we do this with you know, other kind of mechanisms and stuff like that.
Yeah, and more importantly, these aren't just things of the past. These can also be, you know, we're only a few decisions, political decisions away from these potentially coming back again. I think that's probably one of the most effective things about The Handmaid's Tale, is that, you know, that again is showing a very kind of authoritarian future rule, where, you know, things have just got out of hand. I mean, this is also, you know, what we've got here is kind of ultra capitalism, inequality mixed with a very authoritarian regime, kind of, you might say, a bit like modern day China, perhaps. A mixture of, you know, high power, hyper capitalism and authoritarian rule. Although I'm not saying, you know, people are losing their arms and things like this, but it's, you know, they're taking it to a very extreme. Well, maybe they are. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, that was one thing that it got me. I mean, it was, I think what was also surprised me about this was that this felt very reminiscent of Westworld. Not only because it obviously had Ed Harris as Wilford, but it had a very kind of grim dystopian sort of view of dehumanization, confinement, and a kind of an evil Bond villain sort of super genius that has to kind of organize everything, but organizes it in a way that kind of makes sense for him, but, you know, still leads to large numbers of people suffering. So it was kind of, it felt very familiar with that. And I think this is kind of an interesting thing that's come back, I would say, this idea of your gray area super genius who runs some things, but has to accept all these sort of certain or the shortfalls of their system, but kind of explains why the system is in place. It's a very kind of cynical view, I think, about modern society in a way. It's kind of like, well, you know, yeah, there's massive inequality. There's not really much we can do about it because this is how the system works.
Right.
It's a bit, and it kind of, I got the same kind of feeling from Westworld, and I think it's a bit of a sort of, it's almost a bit sort of defeatist, really. I think you can make systems that are a little more equitable than what we've got, and still kind of, you know, have progress in them. But yeah,
I think, you know, it's interesting as well that you know, like in the one interview that you shared, that you know, Bond's kind of approach, or what he says, is that like he's more focused on the action and story. And these kind of political ideas are something that he feels that he lets stew, but he doesn't like really, he kind of like almost finds it surprising that, you know, these are things that surface and stuff. And yet, to me, like, you know, just the train itself is such a clear metaphor for, you know, kind of runaway capitalism that like, you know, you can't, you know, but help but think that like, you know, this is just showing, you know, like kind of our world and where, you know, if, like you said, we don't have any kind of controls on capitalism, you know, the documentary that comes to mind is The Corporation, where I'll definitely shoot a link for that. And it's still available on YouTube. I was just sharing it the other day. And to me, you know, one of the takeaways from that is this idea that, you know, here we created these entities, right, corporations, and we've given them the kind of rights and the, you know, privileges that kind of go with that of being a, you know, corporal being, like kind of that's why the name corporation. And the problem though is that, like, on the one hand, they have these powers with, you know, kind of almost like, I mean, you know, look at the Amazons and the, you know, the Googles of the world, where they have almost like, you know, near infinite, you know, resources and stuff. And so here's this being that has that. And meanwhile, a lot of times, you know, like kind of they lack, you know, accountability, you know, like kind of the Facebooks, you know, they lack, you know, empathy, because it's, you know, like kind of on the one hand, you have a board of directors or, you know, kind of on and on. But on the other, you know, it's still like, it's kind of, you know, as a being though, it can different times get to the point that it's looking at people as, like you said, human resources and, you know, kind of objects and stuff that, like, you know, is made to do its bidding. And, you know, I mean, certainly we've heard the interviews, the complaints of, you know, Amazon workers saying, like, you know, that they're not getting breaks and not kind of, you know, and so it's like kind of just really, I think that's really stretches like kind of what is possible with, you know, kind of these again, runaway capitalism.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting for me is how you hear about, and this is more in the TV show, they kind of expanded on that as well, is this idea that you're in service of the train, and how the train has become like the religion in a way.
Right.
And it's sort of like, you know, when someone's arm gets kind of frozen off, it's in service of the train or whatever. And it's you know, you have to sacrifice a part of yourself for for this kind of runaway system. And again, it kind of mirrors this other thing that is all too prevalent in the real world, in that no good deed goes undone, and caring for other people seems to be like the lowest of the low kind of thing in society, in that, you know, in servicing the train and the system and applying your skills to better the life of the people in the carriage in front of you is rewarded. Whereas if you're trying to sort of help the people in your own sort of level, well, you get absolutely nothing for that. There's no kind of benefit. In fact, if anything, you lose out more. And that I think is, unfortunately, like very prevalent in our society, I would say. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was this idea that protests and uprisings are engineered. It's kind of, you know, a little conspiratorial. And I like the idea, you know, we talk about revolutions going round, you know, the wheels of the train, etc., etc. Right. And this was kind of, this was quite similar to The Matrix in a way, which is another movie with a sort of like some super genius character that plans society and the bad and the good. It must have been the first one really that I can think of where they had that person as the architect who sort of engineers society. But yeah, it's a real gut punch at the end of the movie to know that this has happened many times over, and all that suffering and death and trying to bring down the system is all part of the system, you know. It's
yeah, just even the word itself,
it's not a feel-good movie.
And just the word itself, revolution, right, is interesting because on the one hand, it's talking about kind of things turning and stuff over, but on the other, it's talking about this idea of like kind of, you know, that it's circular, that like, you know, what's kind of goes around comes around, you know, and so that like, you know, in a way that like it kind of implies this idea that things just keep repeating and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, it's almost like you get back to where you started. It's almost it doesn't really feel like you're progressing in any kind of linear way if you look at it in that respect. Perhaps I'm sure there's a better interpretation, perhaps, but yeah,
I can't help but think of the Beatles song, you know, you know, Get Back.
Yeah, right, Get Back, and Revolution. They had that song as well,
right?
So, but yeah, I mean, I felt there was this kind of rather cynical look at how we kind of this look at authoritarian rule, in that it seems like one part of the message is that without leadership or a structure of control, people devour themselves. Because by the end of the movie, pretty much all of the systems that control everything is in place, and there's just absolute chaos. And that was another thing that I thought was quite interesting on a kind of a philosophical note, is that, you know, by being trapped in the train and trying to rebel inside that, you're actually missing out on the kind of the freedom that you could have had outside of it. You know, all this time they've been circling around and around, and actually the weather's cool enough that for them to go outside and exist, which I thought was really an interesting kind of thing for them to portray in that movie.
Yeah, I always thought that, like, what that implied was that you know, Wilford intentionally kept the people, you know, like, kind of from knowing, you know, like, things had changed and stuff. You know, because certainly, you know, like, he's a super genius. He's no doubt has, you know, kind of ways to, you know, to measure the temperature, right, and stuff. So you would think that he would know that, like, you know, things shifted at a certain point, or was tracking it and stuff. And, you know, just basically kept it to himself. And so, you know, that, like, in other words, you know, sometimes power is about, you know, keeping power or getting more power, more so than, you know, like, kind of that any kind of change, or, you know, like, or you know, anything about, like, kind of, you know, giving people more rights or freedom, and, you know, that kind of thing.
I love that last shot of the polar bear just looking back as well. That was a really funny, kind of surreal shot to end on. Love that. But yeah, no, I mean, he's a kind of an interesting character, Wilford. Yeah, I mean, he seems like a sort of a psychopathic train enthusiast, really, when you look at it in that respect, that he has to keep his kind of train going regardless of all the people that have to die and suffer. It's a weird one. In some respects, he's in service of the train, even though he's the one creating the myths, which is kind of a weird...
And that's a lot of ways, like, kind of, you know, our CEOs, right? You know, like, whether you kind of, you know, talk about, like, kind of, like, you know, the president being a CEO of a country, or you know, like, of course, actual CEOs of companies and stuff, that, like, they different times, you know, it's they're constantly pushing you know, their people to be in service of the company and the greater good, and you know, again, lots of the idea about self-sacrifice and stuff. And certainly, you know, I imagine that we've both been part of, you know, kind of different corporations where they love having their slogans and kind of, you know, the things that are promoted as, like, kind of, you know, virtuous ways to support the company and stuff.
Well, that was one of my favorite lines, was the line where I can't remember who it was, but they said to Chris Evans's character, you know, everyone has their place.
Yes.
And he responds with, that's what people in the best places say to those in the worst, you know. Which I thought was a very, very astute point. Yeah, and I also thought it was interesting that, you know, it's revealed that Gilliam, I can't remember who he is, John Hurt's character at the back, the idea was that the tail and the front work together to manage the train. And, you know, this was the kind of the missed opportunity that the society had. But it also kind of made this other point that really you can't exist without the people at the bottom. You know, the children of the tail were the most important part in keeping the engine running, essentially. And that kind of reminds me a little bit. It's a bit like, again, I always sort of seem to bring up AI in our talks, but it's this kind of thing of, like, you know, we think, you know, self-driving cars, you know, it's wonderful. Elon Musk's super AI is going to run it, when actually it's all of us clicking on those capture images that's doing it. Or it's you know, we're going to make a giant database of all the data about X and Y, and really there's like 300 people in Kenya just cleaning the data up in order so that it can be put into the algorithms. You know, that I feel, you know, in some respects both of these are we're the people doing the whole stuff in the engine room there.
Apparently Gilliam, the name was even, you know, kind of inspired by, you know, Terry Gilliam and stuff, which at some point, you know, I imagine we're going to definitely talk about some of his work and stuff. And, you know, it's kind of like, that kind of reference to me makes it even more believable about that. All this is like has some kind of connection to Willy Wonka and stuff.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's kind of very similar to 12 Monkeys in that it's pretty cold and the animals have kind of taken over and stuff like this. Yeah.
The kids, like Brazil and stuff. So
absolutely, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I mean, I think Terry Gilliam's sci-fi is definitely some of the most not easy watches by any stretch, but some of the really the most imaginative and thought-provoking. Funnily enough, talking of the actual thing that how it all gets started, this idea of putting something in the atmosphere to cool the earth is actually a real notion. And there's a TED talk by a guy called Danny Ellis from 2017 where he talks about this is like it's not the most popular amongst environmental groups, but he says we could just release a kind of it's almost like a chalk dust or something like this, the equivalent of totally kind of non-toxic, and would just but as we can see, we're just tempting fate with something like this. But it is actually like it's a real kind of thing that people are talking about doing. It depends how desperate we get, really, and how well we manage it, which is not looking too good, to be honest.
Well, this gets back to the things we've talked about before about, haven't we learned yet about the dangers of tampering with Mother Nature? Never mind, Planet of the Apes, right, where they were trying to come up with a cure for Alzheimer's. But other times, just in real life, we've seen, we've talked before about, kind of releasing, the snakes to get rid of the rats and on and on
but then again it's kind of it's a difficult balance to weigh up, because at the end of the day it's still better to have a vaccine against smallpox. Life is generally better with that. So it's just I think we're realizing just how thin that line may be between something terrible happening and something not. But
the protein blocks themselves, I felt like that was almost like a callback to Soylent Green. I almost was surprised that it was actually cockroaches. A major spoiler. I suspected that was what was happening to the passengers that were dying off.
Right. I mean, I think what got me was that they'd have to have a huge number of cockroaches. It's like, where are they getting all these cockroaches from? It's almost like, it seems like it would be easier to use something else, but you probably have to actually farm cockroaches to feed that many people on a daily basis in order to do it. And it almost makes you think, wouldn't it be easier to farm some other kind of more palatable insect, perhaps? It was very Soylent Green.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly, I don't know if you've seen kind of the plugs for cricket protein, kind of that's something that's become popular. It's funny, I was asking some friends on Facebook whether they would kind of go for that and stuff, and the majority, I was actually surprised. The majority of people were like, yeah, why not and stuff. So I don't know, maybe instead of cockroaches, then at least it'll be crickets. But poor Jiminy, I guess, hate to see kind of
I know,
him end up in a protein bar.
It could be the logo. I've actually eaten a cricket once.
Oh, okay. Intentionally?
No, intentionally. Although they say that you eat a certain number of spiders and things like this in your sleep without even realizing it. It's something like the average is 2 a night or something, and you don't realize. Right. But I was in a bar in Thailand and I ate a deep fried cricket that someone insisted I tried. It was not great, I'll be honest with you. I won't be lining up to get my cricket protein, to be honest. But although I will say this, it's much more appealing when it's been heavily refined, ground up, and made into something. That is much more than just picking up a cricket and eating it.
Absolutely.
But so another thing I wanted to bring up, which was kind of an interesting visual thing, was the kid lighting the flame. Running through when, and that scene is really, that's really cool that they have all the night vision goggles, and it's now you're really screwed. and apparently that flame is symbolic of some well-known saying, which is like one.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if it's a Korean saying or something, but
Apparently.
one person can start a flame. And
right. I was gonna say that we don't have an English expression just like that, but certainly, yeah, it definitely conveys a very clear image. I think like in other words, it's not a hard metaphor to understand.
Yeah, and I think as well it kind of underpins this whole thing. There's a very kind of sort of tribal, almost sort of caveman, prehistoric life that's going on in the back of this train. That contrasting with the ultra slick kind of high end upper class carriages with their circular aquariums that you can walk through and stuff. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It kind of this idea that there's this real kind of basic kind of brutality that's still very present, even in such a well-engineered system. I think that's, or the engineered system designs in that brutality and deprivation. So yeah, I thought that was interesting.
It's funny how like just like you said, that you have this kind of striking contrast of primitive and technology and stuff, and really what it comes down to in the end is this kind of fight with like fists and primitive weapons and stuff, like, because apparently they ran out of bullets at a certain point and stuff, and that's almost like some of our discussions about how that quote about I don't know about how the next one will be fought, but the one after that we fought with like sticks and stones.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
That brings me to one last thing, which I think was really interesting and kind of prescient about the movie. And this is the idea of how engineering is used in it, in that you have like a head engineer, or the engineers are in control. And this to me sort of is interesting from the idea of large mega IT companies where they were obviously founded by an engineer who sort of keeps things running and designs often almost societal platforms around their own ideas of how things should work. And also kind of technocrats in charge of government and finance who could,
I was going to say,
also be, and it's, you see this as well in Westworld, and I think this is all very telling about our times. I don't know if I could call it the crisis of engineering, or maybe it's the 21st century problem of engineering, but it's this idea of knowing where you need humans and where you don't. Like there's this. Whereas, a lot of the humans to Wilford are quite disposable. He needs the children in order to keep the engine running. He needs very specific things. And likewise in Westworld, both the movies, I guess, and the TV show, there's this, half the problem for Ford is like knowing, where do I need a real human and where do I need a robot? And how many humans can I actually replace with the robots? And where do I really need the real humans, or how human do I need those robots at various levels is kind of an interesting question. And you kind of see that in corporations now as well. There's this idea of, where do we really need the humans? So yeah, I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it does bring up the same or similar question of Westworld, where it does get to a certain point that then, the machines surpass us, and then we don't really need humans. Like kind of from the view of the machines and stuff, and then like kind of which of course is like one of the classic questions of sci-fi is like where is a world without humanity, like kind of where we're headed and stuff, and what does that look like? And like I feel like that's one of the classic kind of questions that we whether it's Star Trek or on and on, like kind of never mind dystopian sci-fi in general and stuff, that kind of really poses that question.
Yeah, can we make it, really is the main question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or if we don't, then what's going to be left over behind? Yeah, it's as I say, like a million other sci-fi movies that, you know, also trying to ask that. But yeah, I think for me, it's almost this idea of, I mean, you can go back to like The Time Machine with H.G. Wells, is this idea of, you know, stuff that, again, it's sort of like this huge disparity between one class of people and another. And, well, it all seems well and good. There's, you know, something underneath or behind or at the back that's kind of not so good or a bit more grim. So, yeah, it's a very classic, I feel like, sort of theme.
Yeah, I feel like that's probably one of the most telling statements, is this idea that, like, you know, if you have capitalism that is really, you know, kind of where there's such a real disconnect between humanity, right, and you know, and for that matter, like, where it's, you know, more focus on everyone kind of staying in their lane, so to speak, and you know, like, just, you know, like Tilda Swinton's line again, I just can't get over it different times, you know, kind of, you know, that I'm the hat, you're the shoe and stuff. And it's like, I feel like that's like kind of, you know, really like sometimes what capitalism would rather enforce, you know, that like everyone just stays, you know, kind of stratified and stuff. And which, of course, the irony to me is that like socialism and you know, ultimately capitalism, or it used to be communism, is about the idea of getting rid of class structure. That's all, you know, like everyone's equal. And, but yet, what's funny is that like that the way they implemented it though, when we look at the Soviet Union, right, was having a central party and this kind of, you know, body that kind of engineered everything, which then kind of creates something like, you know, this Snowpiercer, right, where everything's kind of like about keeping things, you know, keeping order, and that order is more important at the cost of deception, at the cost of, like, you know, kind of that people do still end up being, you know, like, let's face it, the Soviet Union had its party members that were like in the first class and stuff, and then most of the world, you know, like, or, you know, most parts of the Soviet Union was pretty much like the tailies, right, where people were living pretty much in abject poverty. I mean, you know, the most modern example being North Korea, right, where, you know, you just have that kind of disparity and stuff.
Well, I think as well as in, you know, in to the detriment of equality, it's also just in simple detriment to efficiency. You know, one of the biggest problems with communism were you just had to try and keep track of everything centrally. Like, how do you make sure everyone gets an equal sort of share of food across this vast population from one big office? Then you just need these massive kind of centralized sort of bureaucracies to try and do this. And they said they just never operated as well, because you just can't deal with it all from one central place. And I think what's interesting about the lesson, I guess, learned from that by modern capitalism is that you just need to centralize the money creation and the system of that. Everything else can kind of function by itself and let it do its thing. But as long as there's kind of some kind of, you know, orderly way of funding things and controlling that, it's the rest can kind of take care of itself, really. But yeah, just, I mean, it's a grand sort of statement on how you have to have distributed systems, really, in order to for things to work properly.
Well, I think that's a good time to kind of dive into the series that was apparently, you know, kind of passed hands back and forth over the past few years. And I suspect with, you know, Bong Joon Ho's success, you know, at the Oscars and stuff, it kind of like, I think maybe gave the final spurt of funding for them to finish it and stuff. And what we end up with is kind of a mixed bag, you know, because certainly on the one hand, it takes the basic premise of Snowpiercer and it actually involves some of, you know, kind of the original ideas and stuff. But the kind of one of the striking differences is this idea of, you know, like instead of 100 cars, you have 1,000 cars and stuff. And I can just imagine what that would look like, you know, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's I feel there are some bits they've expanded on a bit, but I think for me the problem with it is that they've expanded on the stuff that I wasn't particularly interested in. And then, yeah, there's a lot of sort of inequality and the rights of this carriage against that carriage and things. But I think it's kind of like I said earlier about this kind of how low these people have been pushed in terms of their exploitation and depravity. It kind of glosses over all of that. It's a very kind of TV veneer. They don't get into any of those gruesome details because in a funny sort of way, I think the movie is part horror movie in a way. There's actual sort of physical kind of gore and horror, and there's lots of implied stuff as well. And the TV show doesn't like to sort of venture into those areas, I would say, anywhere near as much. And there were some sort of surreal glimpses, which I was quite sort of glad that they did keep in the TV show. Trying to think of a good example. What was it? I think the dad's eyeball was actually quite fun. The fact that she managed to kind of like knock his eyeball out with a fork, and he, she plays with his eyeball. that was actually kind of like one of the bits I really enjoyed the most about that. Nothing wrong here in this family, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I think that the trial about cutting dicks off was quite funny as well. It was sort of unnecessary, really, but it did kind of like liven it up a bit.
Well, as you kind of pointed out, we took a story that was relatively self-contained, and now you have to expand it into a series, right, over multiple seasons. What story would you tell? And so it seemed like what I thought was interesting in the very first episode, you kind of like seemed like the setup was basically going to be the movie kind of, I don't know about rehash, but more or less the same idea. But then they quickly interrupted that and kind of just made it clear to you that but actually we're going to go a very different direction. And it seemed almost like a setup of we're going to have CSI on a train, in the future or stuff. Because it seemed like they were going into procedural territory. And then they kind of just shifted gears again, and we come to realize that wasn't the case. And that's actually when, for me, it kind of got interesting, because they did kind of have. I felt like once they kind of almost like did away, if you will, with that kind of premise and stuff, that then they kind of started moving ahead again with the this ongoing revolution. That on the one hand, it was like kind of more back to the original spirit of the movie, but also I felt that that was just more, and it wasn't just the fighting, but it just had more at stake, and it felt more like we were more invested in kind of what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't seem as nihilistic a revolution as the one in the movie, that's for sure. It did seem like there was some chance that they could kind of pull it all together. And I think as well, the clever thing they did was they made Melanie Cavill more of a grey character.
Oh yeah.
I like the fact that the draws weren't just to kind of a prison; they were actually her way of trying to kind of suspend life. That made her, not like the complete sort of terrible dictator of the train. And also, the fact that she had no, and probably quite rightfully so, no hope that the other people in first class or whatever would be able to do a better job. Because obviously wasn't an easy one. But I think it was good. They made quite a sort of interesting grey area in her character that was quite fun to explore. And of course, also that was more realistic because the conditions in the tale don't seem anywhere near as bad as they were in the movie. People did lose arms and stuff like this, but you had to do. It wasn't for having a shoe. it was for actually doing something properly wrong. So it felt more kind of a just society in that respect. I think as well there was just sort of some other sort of interesting stuff, like this idea of marrying into different classes, and that gives you this ability to move up in the train was kind of an interesting idea. But yeah, I mean, for me, I think the whole thing, there's been a murder and there's been a detective, we need a detective to tour you through the train. It was kind of, my problem with having any kind of detective thing in a sci-fi show is that basically you can just make up the rules as you go along, because it's not really grounded in reality. So there's not really those stakes that there would be in something that's contemporary, which makes them more interesting. And CSI, I guess, was the first one that kind of added a sci-fi element to some degree, because the technology that they use, and I'm not even sure like a lot of that was real at the time, but they made it look pretty. And that only works if, like in something like Minority Report, where it's more of a tool to show you what's happened to technology and how dystopian it's become. It becomes more a showcase of what could be rather than the case itself, which you're not really even, it's kind of like the boss is the bad guy, right? In Minority Report, you kind of guess that from the outset, but it's more of like, how can you go about
gaming the system, I guess.
Gaming the system, yeah, exactly, yeah. In the future, so yeah.
I thought it was interesting to pick, like kind of, an African American stuff. Daveed Diggs as Leighton, who's this detective and stuff. I felt like in a way that like whether or not they knew what was coming up with like kind of the whole Black Lives Matter thing, it just was really an interesting choice there. Yeah,
and I think he does a pretty good job, really. I would say one of the shortfalls of the TV show is that, in a way, it starts off quite leisurely. It doesn't really feel like very much is happening per se, compared to the movie, which moves pretty quickly. But then it's just like you are actually kind of, there's this steady stream of plot things that are continuously happening, but not much character, really, I would say. I didn't really identify with many of the characters at all, and I think that's the problem with setting something in a train where you have no perspective on those people's lives. That's normally a big part of a TV show. You're going to get to know the characters in a bit more depth, and it isn't so reliant. But this was just sort of plot point after plot point. It's like, oh, we're splitting up the train. Now the train's coming back together. Now there's a second train. Right. It's like, there's only 10 episodes and we've already kind of... I still didn't really make a lot of sense to me why they needed to do all that, really. Why they needed to split the train up. And I mean, they seemed like they were kind of winning the revolution, then they were losing it the next episode, and then they were splitting the train up, and there's been a murder, then there's not a murder, and she's alive and then she's dead. It's like so much kind of happened, but you didn't really feel like there was any real meaning, or you didn't feel like you uncovered more depths about the society too much from these events, which is in the movie you kind of felt like that. You kind of felt as you progressed through the train, you learned more interesting things about that society. This one, you kind of, after the reveal with Melanie, there wasn't really much more to learn. I didn't really feel, to be honest.
Yeah, I felt like she's probably the one character that in the end you kind of she had a lot of mystery and stuff, and then I feel like I wouldn't say she's fully developed, but I think she was definitely one of the most compelling. And I think, no small part is, having an actress like, Jennifer Connelly, like, she's just like, just one of those kind of actors that you just kind of have watched like over the years. And, you and I have talked about how like different times is a shorthand. And I feel like different times she brings like this kind of combination like strength and vulnerability that is cliche in one respect, but also it really kind of works well for a character that like seems like she's going to be like a Tilda Swinton kind of evil tyrant thing and stuff, but then ultimately ends up kind of, we start understanding a lot more that she's actually this beautiful mind for this whole story, and how she's the one that kind of was really the Wilford and stuff. Again, major spoiler and stuff. And and I think like she pulls it off. Like, in other words, I don't think that like having a actor who wasn't as strong, it probably would be harder to believe that like that she's a MIT grad / like kind of engineer of the super train / what's called somebody who's been keeping a self-contained world going for the X number of years and stuff.
Yeah, no, she's a very interesting actress, actually, Jennifer Connelly. I mean, the other movie I think of when I think of her is Requiem for a Dream, because she has this kind of quality about her where she actually seems quite removed from as a person in those roles. It's a weird thing to try and describe, but it's also quite compelling to watch in that you don't really feel like she's all there completely, if you know what I mean. But she is, but you know, it's weird. I got the same impression from that, and it kind of worked in that context because she was a drug addict, and you know, they also have this sort of slightly sort of vacant thing of like, you don't really know when you're talking to a real person or when they're on autopilot. And that's maybe a good sort of, no pun intended, kind of thing with this. It was kind of like you didn't know if she was actually running on something where she was actually considering all the outcomes, or if she was just kind of going with what the program was. And I think she kind of portrays that she manages to balance this kind of thing of like, she almost comes across as a complete psychopath with no empathy whatsoever,
right.
But occasionally can also kind of show some sort of human sides. So yeah, I think she's a really interesting actress, actually.
Yeah, I think what we'll never know is, you know, how the back and forth of the production, you know, like kind of, you know, where it started off being TNT, then it went to TBS, then it went back to TNT and stuff. You know, it's hard to say like how much of that really influenced, because you can only imagine that like it created havoc for, you know, kind of the screenwriters. It created havoc for like the actors and stuff, kind of, you know, like, and then the production teams, right? So, you know, like, never mind the kind of it takes a village to make a film kind of idea, but I think different times, like, you know, here's this village that like, you know, who the chief was, or like kind of, you know, who they were falling under in terms of what's called. It almost feel like that, like at different times the villages kind of be basically taken over by different, you know, kind of tribes and stuff. And I think that's kind of like why it you know, kind of some of these different plot confusions and, you know, like maybe even sometimes, you know, the performances is kind of like thrown, you know, it's just kind of, it's got to be pretty disorienting for both the actors and the overall production.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was the problem I had with Leighton's character, was that at some points they're sort of portraying him as a father figure. Next, they're kind of portraying him as the sharp detective. Next, he's like the sort of, he's lost love. And then next, he's like the revolutionary. And it was kind of like they tried to do so many different things with that character in a relatively short space of time that you didn't really get a real sort of grasp on what his sort of core that he revolved around. So yeah, that was a bit sort of confusing, in all honesty. I did like the train slang. I thought all that stuff was quite funny. Because I do like it when people try and make up future slang or kind of alternate reality slang. That's just track talk, and you know, and referring to them as tailies and what was it, like tail suckers and all this kind of stuff. I loved all that stuff. Right. It was really silly. You know, it all kind of have mercy on your spark. That was one of my favorite ones. And chain relationships and all this kind of stuff. It was it all kind of reeked a little bit too much of like the trying too hard. And I think my main problem was, as I say, was, you know, there's a second train. Is that really like the most interesting thing we can add to this? You know, and yeah, and there's no Will. Well, I mean, the no Wilford thing was kind of okay, but it needed a few more good ideas of what to do with this, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting that, like, you know, if Willie Wonka was indeed like kind of, you know, the hidden inspiration of the movie or the original stuff, that then Wizard of Oz apparently was the kind of, you know, behind this series and stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
One thought that was also kind of interesting was that they kind of threw in like kind of, you know, the whole fight night thing too, right? It did at the same time though really call back to like kind of, you know, we something out of like Ben-Hur, where like you know, in the decline of the Roman Empire, they kind of had these, you know, kind of games to distract people, and then, you know, we really did see the effect of that, like kind of, you know, like because everyone was about to have this you know, like kind of revolt, and then they kind of were pacified for a bit and stuff.
Well, yeah, this is kind of interesting, actually, this whole idea of, sympathetic sort of emotional reactions to things. I was listening to a podcast with, I think it's Chris Darcy, who is the most connected man apparently, and he does this thing where he actually watches YouTube videos about people getting anxious if he's trying to get rid of his own anxiety. Or other things like this. Or if he's feeling really super angry, he'll watch, a YouTube of someone getting really angry, and that kind of he finds that actually lowers his own kind of desire or subconscious sort of feeling towards those emotions. And he's like, he has this whole sort of, he's engineered his whole life online, so he knows that at 11:14, if X and Y has happened, this will cause him to get angry or anxious, and I will then watch a YouTube video 3 minutes beforehand so that I don't feel this way. It's very interesting. He's taken this whole idea of big data and kind of made it personal, which is an interesting idea. But what I think is interesting is, like, one of the things I always see people watching on like WhatsApp or sharing is videos of people getting angry with, like, in stores or doing something stupid where they're like causing trouble. And I wonder if this is really just a reflection of their, there is a widespread kind of subconscious desire to fight back against a system. And we are kind of self-medicating by watching these things so that we can watch that and go, oh yeah, well, that's stupid getting that angry, isn't it? It's one of those things. I actually wonder, in a way, you could be conspiratorial and say these things are put out there to make us not get too angry and
I wouldn't
protest or something.
Yeah, I would put it.
I don't know if I go that far.
Well, right. I would just put it as that, like, as you and I have talked about that, like, I would not give enough credit that, like, there's a big conspiracy to it. But I feel like, on the other hand, though, that certainly we're kind of doing it to ourselves. That, like, in other words, on the one hand, like, kind of, going back to the Roman Empire and stuff like that, they were, kind of, they realized that kind of as long as they entertained the population and stuff, that then they kind of kept them pacified. And I feel like that's, if anything, like, kind of the closest that we have is that, like, there's maybe some leaders that, like, they are supporting, like, kind of, entertainment and different, realms and stuff. And, like, let's say you're the mayor of a city, right? And that if you get to a certain point that, like, there's crime and other kind of problems and stuff, but hey, if we can, like, get the new stadium going and have sports and, like, I mean, that's where I see it, that, like, different times, it's probably leaders making initiatives, realizing that, like, that a people that is entertained is a people that's, pacified to a degree. And I think that's it, that, like, I don't think we need a big conspiracy. I think that different times people realize, that truth.
Yeah. And I think as well that it's easy to sort of draw a conspiratorial note of things when, essentially we have algorithms that really are watching what we do, and to actually tap into our subconscious desires.
Yeah.
We can look at the sort of things that are trending or things that get pushed to the surface are actually just like society's subconscious desires, really. And you can kind of see it as a reflection of that. It's like, Timothy Leary sort of said, the internet is like a big bad trip, and we're just kind of this stuff's just bubbling to the surface, right? So it's interesting in that respect. I mean, but that's, I think, what's kind of disappointing about this TV show is whereas I found the movie was really kind of tapping into a lot of things that came later on, this real, it deals with climate change, inequality, class structure, how you actually run a society, what would actually work, way ahead of its time, I think. And this, I kind of feel like they've taken that and they've just kind of stuck a CSI on top of it and a few other bits and pieces. And any kind of, like, I always kind of like roll my eyes when I see, it's the missing son or daughter or dad or familial connection that then turns up at the end of the season or something like that. It's always a bit, that was what's kind of refreshing about Game of Thrones, is that you kind of knew about the whole family at the beginning, and actually what you saw was their journey rather than people being revealed so much.
Yeah, it definitely, like, when you do something like that, it really smacks of like kind of, you know, TV drama, right? Instead of, you know, something that, like you said, like a Game of Thrones, that's like, which, you know, like kind of, you know, if anybody who has not watched the whole entire series, major spoiler, that you know, they really lost it when they kind of strayed from, you know, the source material, and they had to come up with their own, you know, kind of ending, because, you know, like, that's the thing that's funny, right? Like, that when a series like kind of writes beyond, you know, what happens in the, you know, the original novel or the original source material and stuff like that, that then, you know, kind of, it's almost like then beyond being unfamiliar territory is like kind of that, you know, you have to have really strong writers to pull that off well, and then, you know, otherwise they're like, you know, the fans are gonna be, number one, critical as it is, but then even more so that, like, you know, if you just don't execute too well on stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, this is from what I've understood of how George R. Martin writes, and the difference between that and the last season of Game of Thrones was that he wrote from the perspective of what was happening in the world, and the characters were then reacting to those events.
Right.
Whereas it changed to, it's driven by the characters in that last season. And that's you can sort of draw a similar thing with Snowpiercer a little bit. In the movie, it's all about, you know, what are the dark secrets, and how is this society functioning? And again, Chris Evans's grayness of his morality is revealed through the world rather than him making choices himself.
Right.
During the movie, I would say anyway. And this kind of feels like, and I think that's maybe the weakness of this, is that most TV stuff is based on the characters, but they haven't really established the characters too much in Snowpiercer, the TV show. So yeah, it's got a lot of plot, but not much philosophy or not much kind of empathy with the characters, I would say. But it was still a pretty decent watch.
It was definitely entertaining. I mean, you know, like that's the thing that I felt like the you know, they did kind of present some interesting life and death choices where, you know, like kind of, you know, again, major spoiler that ultimately he had to choose, you know, but it did, on the one hand, it was interesting kind of to present him with a no-win scenario and stuff like that. But the other, it felt kind of set up, you know, like you said, like kind of having this kind of train separate stuff was an interesting twist. But it did feel like kind of, you know, things were set up for that and stuff. And then ultimately set up for this big reveal that, you know, Melanie Cavill's, you know, daughter is in fact like on the second train and stuff.
Yeah, that just annoyed me. To hell. And I had to say, it was kind of like when I was watching the whole train separation thing, I was kind of, it took me quite a while to realize why they were even separating the train. It was like, because they did it quite quickly, and it was like, oh, the rich people are in this carriage, but they're in that carriage, and somehow they've gone through a tunnel to get to there, and they're going to unlink that and then do that, and they're going to go at the junction and then join it back up again. But also, there's also the people who were taken prisoner from the tail, who were attacking the front, and now in this middle carriage. It was just like you had to keep track of where everyone, no pun intended, where they were, and yeah, it just kind of it didn't really all kind of pull together too well for me. But
I think we'll let's call it. It's an interesting kind of thing of what will happen in the next season and stuff like that. At the same time, you know, like kind of I don't feel like you know that right now, at least, you know, it seems like for us that like it's like kind of like it's an interesting watch, but it's not as compelling as kind of like it could have been, because certainly here you have like, you know. That you're now blowing up the basic story into like, you know, multi episodes and stuff like that. So you had room to kind of, you know, really tell a different story, but at the same time, it does seem like all they kind of did was like, you know, throw in a dash of CSI, then swung to like family drama, and meanwhile, like, you know, not touch on any of the basic, like you said, the core themes and ideas of the original that really they could have and stuff. And then it's almost like in a way I feel that you had the opposite of Westworld, where Westworld, the original movie, touched on those ideas, and then once they put it into like a series, they really kind of took that room and really dove more deeply into different ideas of what does it mean to be human, and what is kind of artificial life look like and stuff like that. And so I feel like here we have like kind of very different executions of what's possible with taking a original movie and then kind of expanding it into a series.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing they do with Westworld is that almost every season is basically like a different genre. Like the first one was kind of almost a retelling of the original story, but with more sex and violence. The second season was kind of a detective story, oh, we're seeing a pattern emerge here. And then the third one was kind of like Alias or something. It was like a spy show or something. Right. Yeah, that's one way to do it. Just change the genre every season. That way you'll surprise people. But I mean, I think there's definitely, we've seen a shift in the way people watch or consume media, because I kind of feel like we've all kind of, this meta understanding of what's gone before and what we're used to is something that we don't forget. And it's very hard to make a movie now where you do actually surprise people without it coming across as too intentional, or you're actually saying something interesting, which is where I think Snowpiercer works really well. We've got used to TV, I think the preference now is more towards TV because of the longer form. You can surprise people. You don't always know what's happening because that time frame is much more mixed up. So you can have these high production values like a movie where it can take you off to interesting sort of worlds, but you're not necessarily going to expect it or expect how things are going to play out. The problem is now is that we've also got used to that. So then you have to do the tricks like Westworld does, is change genre to completely sort of subvert people's expectations. And I mean, I think it's fairly soon it's going to be almost like, and that's kind of actually what was good about things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when they kind of went a bit off the rails, where they had like the musical episode, or they had the episode where everything was silent and things like this. I think those were kind of very foretelling of what we'll see. I think we'll see TV getting a lot more random in that respect.
Yeah,
God knows what happened to movies though, but yeah.
Well, I'm still waiting for kind of the immersive, interactive, movies and stuff, and that's a whole other discussion for another time. Yeah, VR. It's coming. It's coming. The days when we're all sort of sitting around looking like this will all seem very silly very soon, when we're wearing some kind of wearable device over our eyes. I did want to make one mention of, I feel like Ruth should deserve, some kind of mention. She's the assistant to Melanie Cavill and stuff. Actually, I followed her from the American series, which was like kind of the family in the Russian spy family in the 80s that was kind of pretending to be American citizens and stuff. And she's actually kind of plays like kind of the dupe, if you will, like kind of, in other words, she falls for the fact that like she believes like the cover of the husband and stuff like that, and then falls victim to that. So it's interesting how apparently the shorthand that she's kind of going under is like the person who falls victim for different guises and stuff.
Yes, very strong convictions and gets duped, basically. Yeah, it does make me wonder if, like, you were planning to become an actor, if you could take a look at your own life and see what your own shortcomings were, and then you could just look for parts where, like,
that you can slot that kind of
yeah, slightly clumsy or something like that. Yeah, I'll just go for all the clumsy roles. I'll just fit right in there,
And then one other person, Zara, who's kind of basically the traitor, and that's interesting that we haven't talked about that. That basically when you move up train, you're a sellout and stuff like that. And Zara is played by Sheila Vand, who actually it's the movie that I kind of know her from is the girl that walks alone at night, and that's actually like a really interesting movie, and that where here you have a Persian actress that she's basically, on one hand, it's a vampire movie and stuff, but the other, it really kind of has things that's kind of unique to that culture, and I'm sure that like watching it even different, I've watched it a couple times and stuff. I feel like I still miss some different things that like the cultural references that probably people from the culture or more familiar with the kind of the Iranian culture are that they would get and stuff. So and she has that kind of very distinctive. There's something about like her the way that she in a scene kind of engages with another actor that like is really kind of like that's uniquely her.
yeah I mean, definitely she was quite interesting to watch, and I can't really quite understand why, but I'll definitely check out that movie. It sounds interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, it's, again, though, I kind of feel like there was a lot of the actors were really good in this. I don't really feel there's enough kind of human story for them to really kind of stretch their talents into.
And yeah, it just it feels like a lost opportunity that like they could have, because you've gotten you've given yourself the room to do it, but yet like kind of like you said, the focus was on these kind of plot twists and that kind of thing, and in some ways that like it kind of goes to familiar television series territory where they could be kind of going more to the kind of things that like shows like Breaking Bad are doing and stuff, or I'm trying to think some other, or even like Ozark is a recent watch that I started kind of watching as well, that you like you said, like kind of where you have the space to kind of get more into what the character's about, and like basically taking them and okay, what is somebody like a Jason Bateman like kind of would do in this situation and stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it really shows you when you see something like Breaking Bad. I mean, really most of the time you're just watching or thinking about how Walter White is going to deal with a particular situation. That's really the real crux of it, and how he's going to get out of it, or how he's going to deal with this. How bad is he going to go? How good is he going to go? And things like this. And of course Paul Aaron's character, which Aaron Paul, sorry, I can't remember his name now. But
Jesse Pinkman.
How he's going to get manipulated, or how he's going to react to these things. Jesse Pinkman, right? Yeah. He was almost like the sort of the human reaction,
that
you identified with, and Walter White was like the sort of the thinking element of Breaking Bad. The kind of logical and emotional kind of cause around that show, but it just shows you, just with like really just those are the two characters you're really focusing on most of the time in that show, and it just shows you with just two characters you can add so much depth through 5 seasons, no less. And here we've got like about 10 different main characters, and we don't really know any of them. So, but I think I've made my point now. So I'm still going on about it.
So, coming up, we've got RoboCop and Total Recall. We're basically going to be diving a little bit into sci-fi, but more specifically into the work of Paul Verhoeven. As we mentioned, that we feel like it's kind of like in a lot of ways, his body work kind of represents a lot of use of sci-fi and other genres as a way of kind of satire, and also make different interesting commentary. So that's coming up. And so as always, thanks for watching. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you next time.